All right, guys, we are now at module number 10, the substance-related disorders as it relates to children and teenagers. I want to welcome you back to class, and we are making quick progress on our class this semester. We are almost here towards the end. We just have one more module, module number 11, after we complete this module, module number 10. And then you're going to spend the remaining few weeks at the end of the class working on your final exam project, which I will be giving you more information about here in the coming weeks. But welcome back to this module, module number 10. Many of you are taking classes with us in our program in Human Services because you have an interest in drug and alcohol counseling. You're working towards your LCDC or something similar to that. So as a result of that, it's very possible that some of you have already taken several other classes in our program around drugs and alcohol. And so some of what we cover in this module, in this class, the Problems of Children and Adolescents class, module 10, may be a little bit of a refresher or a review for you. But what I've tried to do in this module is focus some basic information on how substance-related disorders and drug and alcohol problems relate to kids. You cannot have a class like this, Problems of Children and Adolescents, and like we talked about last week, talk about child abuse and neglect. That's not something that we like to talk about, but you got to talk about that in a class like this. And then also too, you can't have a class like this and not talk a little bit about substances and drugs and alcohol. So that's what we're doing basically in this module. This is a module like many others in our class that really we could have an entire 16-week class just devoted to substance use and abuse and addiction in teens especially. This is really primarily a teen issue, although we're seeing younger and younger kids being exposed to and experimenting with substances these days. But primarily we're talking about adolescents in this module. And we could have an entire course just talking about kids and substance use, but we're just hitting it for a week here in this quick module. So obviously that tells you what we're going to do is kind of hit the high points as best we can. So what I want to do in this little video just really quickly, as I've done every single week, is just summarize some of the information I've got for you in the lecture notes as you get ready to do your discussion question and do your homework as we kind of wind our class down. So one of the things that's interesting about substance abuse in kids is, again, it's one of those things that developmentally, because of where teenagers especially are, substances, drugs and alcohol often come into play. Number one, we live in a society where substances are all around us. Number one, kids grow up in homes where and exposed to media where substances are promoted. They grow up in homes where alcohol or other substances are available or prescription medications, and so it's something that they are used to in the world in which we grow up in. And then they hit adolescence. And when kids hit adolescence developmentally, what do we know about kids developmentally when they hit adolescence? Well, we know lots of things. Number one, we know kids are looking for independence. They want to exert their independence and sort of carve their niche in the world out. This is who I am. We also know, interestingly, kids want to fit in. There's sort of that balance, and maybe you remember being a teenager. You wanted to be your own person, but you didn't want to stand out too much for most of us, right? So kids also, too, want to fit in, and they want to appear cool, and they want to be accepted by their peers and those around them. They're looking to push boundaries and limits. Kids just naturally in adolescence are looking for, where are the lines? Where can I push boundaries and limits? And where can I have my own kind of, their own form of rebellion? Most teenagers have their own form of rebelling against whatever rules or restrictions are around them, some kids more so than others. We know that developmentally, from a neurological perspective, that kids' brains in adolescence are still developing. And so therefore their rational choice making decisions are not real strong. And we know oftentimes too in a teenage brain, because dopamine especially is so predominant and prevalent, that kids are drawn to euphoria, they're drawn to something exciting, they're drawn to something interesting, right? And so substances play a role because of all of that, all those multi-level kinds of layers that we see come into play. And then you add on top of that the stress of being a teenager in the 21st century and the family issues that kids grow up around, and just the social norms that we live in today around medicine and marijuana especially, and tobacco and alcohol especially, and just the fact that we kind of live in a world today where kids see adults experimenting and saying and sort of, for example, with the legalization, a push for legalization of marijuana, for example, kids see that and they see adults pursuing that, so that kind of influences how they look at the world. So all of that comes into play and influences why we sometimes, not always, but we sometimes see kids struggling with substance abuse problems. So I give you some information in your module about something called the cumulative risk model. I remember as a student being introduced many, many years ago to this idea that usually there's not one reason why a person struggles with a problem. There's usually 17 little reasons, and they all kind of come together at one time. And so that's called the cumulative risk model. I asked you a question about that in your homework, I think, as well. So make sure you look at that. But that's oftentimes, I oftentimes cover that in this module because it's a good module, it's a good idea, it's a good model, it's a good concept to kind of grab onto, especially when we think about why is it that kids may be drawn to substances and have problems with substances. So I give you a little bit of information about that. We also know that it's important for us to talk about, I mentioned this in the module as well too. This is an important topic for this module as well too, because we know that one of the greatest risk factors for adult substance use problems, we know there are some risk factors from our research. We know that there are some risk factors that make someone more prone and more likely to struggle with substance abuse problems as an adult. And one of them is experimentation as a teenager. The younger someone begins experimenting, the higher the risk factor goes up, the likelihood goes up that they will struggle with substance abuse problems as an adult. The quicker, the earlier someone is exposed to and experiments with, the two E's, exposure to, experimentation with, the younger someone is, we know that this increases the risk that someone's going to struggle as an adult with substance abuse problem. Is that a given that that's going to happen? That's not a given. We just know that it just makes it more likely. And if you ask most adults, if you were to go around today, if you were to go to a 12-step meeting or a rehab facility where you have adults who are receiving substance abuse treatment, and you were to survey all of those folks who were getting drug and alcohol treatment, and you were to ask them, when did you start abusing substances? At what age? What? 70, 80% are going to give you an age below the age of 18. Every once in a while, you'll find someone say, well, it wasn't until I was in college when I was like 20 or when I was 25. That happens, but that's pretty rare. What's most typical for adults who have substance abuse problems is they'll say when I was 14, when I was 13, when I was 15 or whatever, sometimes even younger. And so for that reason, not to be pessimistic or negative, but just to be realistic and do some prevention work, we know that it's important for us to be aware of the ways in which kids can struggle with substances in teenage years and childhood years, especially in kids. So what I do in this module, you're going to see very, very quickly. I'm not going to summarize it here for you, but I give you just some basic information related to some substance-specific information related to kids. So for example, I'll give you some information about tobacco and vaping and marijuana and alcohol and prescription drugs and inhalants as it relates specifically to kids and what we know as far as those specific substances with teenagers especially, and just some and with each of those some unique items, some of that you're already aware of, some unique kind of factors that kind of come into play. For example, with smoking and with alcohol and with marijuana, those three especially, we know that kids especially are drawn to those because of where our society is and they're available. And in many ways. And many kids, for example, do not see tobacco and do not see marijuana and do not see alcohol, number one, as drugs. They see it as acceptable. They see it as okay. They don't understand what the big deal is oftentimes. They don't recognize the potential dangers that can be there. And then there's the world in which we live in sort of promotes a lot of that to them as well too. So I give you some substance specific information in the module as well too that I want you to review as it relates to children and adolescents as well too. Nothing heavy. Again, some of that you've already received in other classes. I just try to make it as specific as I can to children and adolescents. So this is module number 10. Come back next week, our last module. When you come back next week we're in module number 11, we're going to be winding up this lecture portion of the class. But for this week, this important week, module number 10, go through, look at your lecture notes, do your homework, do your discussion question. I will see you next time. All right, have a good one.